I never thought a garage could feel like the center of a war, but that's exactly what it became the day I came home from work and saw a car in my spot. A massive shiny SUV that I had never seen before, sitting in my garage as if it belonged there. And for a moment I froze, staring through the windshield at the polished dashboard, the empty space I had claimed for years now invaded by someone who clearly didn't care about my property or my time. And then I saw her, standing on the sidewalk like she owned the street. A woman in her late 40s with perfectly coiffed hair, sunglasses perched on her nose, and that smug, self-satisfied smile that immediately made my blood boil. And I realized at once that this was Karen, the neighbor everyone in the HOA whispered about but no one wanted to confront, the type of person who seemed to thrive on control and had an opinion about everything from lawn decorations to the exact shade of paint on our houses. And for a moment I wondered if I had imagined the audacity of it all, if maybe I was overreacting to a simple mistake. But no, I knew her reputation. I had heard the stories from other neighbors who had fallen victim to her endless rules and petty complaints, and the fear that she would make this a bigger problem had me tense and alert, my fingers curling around the steering wheel as I debated whether to knock on her window, yell, or call the HOA immediately. And then I did what I always try not to do. I stepped out of my car, my shoes crunching against the gravel, my pulse hammering in my ears, and I approached her calmly, forcing a smile that didn't reach my eyes, and said, "Hi, that's my garage." And she turned slowly, looked me up and down with that same smug smile, and replied as if it were the most normal thing in the world, "Oh, I didn't know. I'll move it later." As if those words were enough to erase the violation of my space, and I felt a hot wave of anger rise up, because later never came, not the next hour, not the next day, and every time I came home, there she was, parking with that same sense of entitlement, refusing to acknowledge that this was not her property. And each time I thought about confronting her again, my stomach twisted with frustration because I had tried reasoning, I had tried politeness, I had tried patience, and nothing worked. The HOA shrugged it off when I called them, claiming it was a minor misunderstanding and not worth their time. And suddenly I understood that no one was going to fix this for me, that the rules they claimed to enforce were only suggestions if you had the right attitude. And I felt a mix of fear and determination that made my hands shake slightly as I walked back to my car, realizing that I had to find a way to reclaim my garage and my peace without becoming the kind of person everyone whispered about behind their doors. And I began to think, planning quietly while standing in my driveway, about a way to set boundaries that Karen could not ignore, about how to make her understand that my space was mine and that her sense of entitlement had limits. And even though I didn't know exactly how I would do it, a spark of strategy lit in my mind, a dangerous but controlled idea that would require patience, observation, and timing. And as I finally got into my car, the sun casting long shadows across the neighborhood, I felt the first real sense of control I had all week, knowing that whatever I decided, it had to be precise, deliberate, and unforgettable. And I understood in that moment that this wasn't just about a garage. It was about respect, about boundaries, about asserting myself in a world where people like Karen thought rules were optional and politeness was weakness. And I felt a strange thrill of anticipation mixed with dread because I knew that the coming days would test my patience, my composure, and my ability to execute a plan without giving in to rage. And I also knew that the outcome would set the tone for the rest of the neighborhood, that this small space of asphalt and steel had become the stage for something much bigger than a parking spot. And as I sat there, gripping the wheel and staring at the garage door I had defended so many times, I made a silent promise to myself that this time, I would not let anyone take what was mine without consequence, that I would find a way to turn frustration into strategy. And even though I didn't yet know how, the fire of resolve burned quietly inside me, making me aware that the battle for my garage was only just beginning. The next morning, I woke with a tight knot in my chest, thinking about the garage and Karen's smug face. And as I stepped outside, my heart sank again because there she was, casually leaning against her car down the street, waving at a neighbor as if she had done nothing wrong. And the sight made my blood boil because it wasn't just about the SUV in my space anymore. It was about the principle, about being invisible in my own home while someone else took what I had earned and maintained for years without permission. And I tried to tell myself to stay calm, to breathe, but every glance at her made my jaw clench and my thoughts race with possibilities, none of which felt safe or satisfying enough. And so I approached her again, slower this time, trying to mask the rising fury with a tone that sounded casual. "You still haven't moved your car from my garage?" and she laughed softly, a sound meant to irritate, and replied, "Oh, I'll get to it eventually, don't worry." And in that moment something inside me snapped, a sharp awareness that polite requests and explanations had no effect on her. That reasoning with Karen was like trying to move a mountain with a feather, and I realized that if I didn't act, she would continue this behavior indefinitely, stepping over boundaries because she believed there would never be consequences, and I felt the walls of frustration closing in around me, a mix of anger, disbelief, and the urge to do something that would finally make her understand. Because the HOA had already made it clear that they were unwilling to step in, claiming they had more important matters to address. And I understood then that the neighborhood hierarchy she thrived on relied on complacency, on the quiet acceptance of her overconfidence, and that realization made the situation feel heavier, as if my home had been invaded not only by a car but by a force that challenged my right to control my own life. And I spent that day watching her, noting her habits. When she left, when she returned, how she interacted with neighbors, every detail that could give me an advantage, because I had made a decision, a silent vow that I would not be steamrolled by someone who treated everyone like a nuisance. And as I observed, I began thinking strategically, calculating ways to reclaim what was mine without risking a public argument or breaking any rules that could come back to haunt me. And the more I watched, the more I realized that Karen's sense of entitlement was not just casual carelessness, it was deliberate, a performance of power designed to make others feel small. And that awareness both terrified and motivated me because I knew I had to respond with precision and patience, the kind that would let her feel the consequences of her actions in full without giving her any excuse to claim victimhood. And as evening fell, I returned inside my house, my mind racing with plans and contingencies, imagining locking the garage in ways that would prevent her from entering, ways that were completely legal but would force her to confront her own audacity. And the thought of stepping away for a few days to let her stew in her own frustration began to take shape as a real possibility. A calculated retreat that could serve as a form of quiet revenge while I maintained my dignity and composure, and I began researching security options, timers, cameras, locks, anything that could give me control over the situation without escalating to confrontation. And as I read through product manuals and HOA regulations, I felt a strange mixture of empowerment and anxiety, knowing that every detail mattered and that one misstep could make the situation worse rather than better. But the determination in me was stronger than the fear, and I felt a pulse of excitement at the idea of watching her scramble without being there in person, imagining the confusion, the irritation, the realization that her usual tactics would no longer work, and I envisioned leaving a subtle note on her windshield, simple and calm, enough to make her aware that her behavior was unacceptable without giving her any opening for argument. And the more I thought about it, the more I saw a path forward, a way to take control of my own space while forcing Karen to face the consequences of her choices. And I felt a surge of adrenaline as I pictured the coming days, planning what to pack, how to leave the house unattended but secure, how to let her make her own mistakes while I remained completely out of reach. And that anticipation was electric, making it almost impossible to sleep because my mind kept replaying scenarios, imagining her frustration, the rumors spreading through the neighborhood, the quiet satisfaction of knowing that I had outsmarted someone who believed they could dominate me. And in that restless night, I began to understand something profound about the situation, that this wasn't just about a garage spot. It was about asserting control in my own life, about proving to myself that I could handle conflict with strategy rather than emotion, and the thought of finally reclaiming my space, my dignity, and my sense of calm after years of navigating passive aggression and unspoken rules made the tension feel almost worth it, like a rope stretched taut, vibrating with every possibility of what could happen next. And as the first light of dawn crept through my blinds, I made my decision fully, silently promising myself that I would execute my plan with patience and precision, that I would leave the garage untouched for 2 weeks, that I would lock it and walk away, allowing Karen to face the consequences of her entitlement. And in that moment, standing in my kitchen with the coffee warming my hands, I felt a strange mixture of fear, excitement, and empowerment, knowing that the rising tension in the neighborhood, the silent battle over a single garage, had transformed into a test of will, strategy, and courage, and I was ready to see how far Karen would go when she discovered that her usual tricks no longer worked, that boundaries could not be ignored, and that sometimes the most powerful revenge was patience, careful planning, and letting someone's own behavior show them who truly held the control as the days passed. My plan began to take shape with a clarity that surprised me. But the deeper I dug into the logistics of leaving my garage untouched while still asserting control, the more personal the conflict became, because Karen's presence was no longer just an irritation. It was a challenge to everything I valued about my home and my sense of self, and I started noticing the little ways she tried to provoke me. From leaving notes in the neighborhood chat criticizing minor details of my property to parking her car in a way that blocked my driveway for a few moments, just long enough to test my patience. And each of these small acts felt like a needle jabbing at my resolve, forcing me to acknowledge the rising tension as more than just an inconvenience, but a confrontation with someone who thrived on control. And it hit me that if I faltered, even slightly, she would sense weakness and escalate. So I began documenting everything, taking photos, writing down times and dates, the exact positions of her vehicle, her interactions with neighbors, and the subtle smirks she gave whenever she caught my eye. And with every entry, I felt both frustration and a growing determination, because it became clear that this was a battle of wills, one I could not afford to lose, not because of pride alone, but because letting her dominate my space unchecked would erode my confidence in every other part of my life. And late one afternoon, as I returned from the grocery store, I found her SUV half in my garage, half in the driveway, tires slightly angled, as if daring me to react, and my stomach knotted at the sight. A surge of anger and disbelief twisting through me, but I reminded myself of the strategy one had committed to, the careful patience that would turn the situation to my advantage, and I forced my hands to relax on the steering wheel, taking a slow breath as I assessed her movements from the safety of my car, noting how she laughed with a friend on the sidewalk, completely oblivious to the fact that I was watching. And in that moment, a dark idea flickered in my mind, one that required absolute self-control and timing, because I realized that if I wanted her to truly understand the limits of her entitlement, I would have to create a situation in which she experienced frustration without my direct confrontation. And the more I thought about it, the more detailed the plan became, down to the exact locks I would use, the subtle note I would leave on her windshield, the timing of my departure, and the way I would monitor the neighborhood remotely to ensure that nothing went wrong. And even though my pulse raced with anticipation, I knew that the stakes had escalated, because Karen was no longer a faceless nuisance. She was a formidable opponent, unpredictable and audacious, and the slightest misstep could turn this calculated experiment into a confrontation that the HOA would scrutinize and that I might regret. Yet that very risk added a thrill I could not deny, a dangerous electricity that made my planning feel alive and urgent. And as I spent that evening preparing, I discovered that Karen had left another note, this one tucked under the wiper of my own car, passive-aggressive in tone, implying that I was somehow being unreasonable and selfish. And reading it, I felt a rush of indignation because it was clear that she had no understanding of boundaries, no respect for other people's space, and no awareness of the frustration she caused. And yet, that indignation only strengthened my resolve, making me more committed to executing my plan perfectly, because I realized that patience, observation, and the ability to let her own arrogance lead her into frustration were my strongest allies. And as night fell, I double-checked the locks I planned to install, researched additional security options, and imagined her reactions in vivid detail, picturing her circling the garage, trying every trick she could think of, calling neighbors, pleading for access and failing. And that vision, more than anything, fueled a strange mix of satisfaction and adrenaline. A reminder that sometimes the quietest victories are the most powerful. Yet just as I felt a growing sense of control, a sudden complication arose when I noticed another neighbor, someone I had trusted, glancing my way with a curious expression and whispering something to Karen, and the thought that someone might unintentionally undermine my carefully laid plan sent a cold wave of panic through me, forcing me to reconsider every angle, anticipate every possible disruption, and prepare contingencies for scenarios I had never imagined. And as I lay awake that night, thinking through every detail, I realized that this situation had become intensely personal, that Karen's arrogance was no longer an abstract annoyance but a direct challenge to my intelligence, my composure, and my ability to assert myself without losing control. And I felt an urgent pulse of emotion, a mixture of anger, fear, and exhilaration, because I knew that the coming days would test me in ways I had never anticipated. that the plan I had envisioned would demand complete discipline and mental fortitude, and that every small victory along the way would be hard-earned. And yet, despite the tension and the stakes, I could not help but feel alive in a way that only confrontation and strategy could make me feel, knowing that each choice, each decision, each act of careful patience would shape the outcome of this silent war over a single garage. And as I finally closed my eyes, exhausted but alert, I understood that the conflict was no longer simply about a parking spot. It was about asserting my authority in a world where people like Karen believed rules were optional, about standing up without screaming, about showing through deliberate action that boundaries matter. And as the first light of morning crept through my blinds, I felt a quiet determination burn within me, knowing that when I finally made my move, the consequences would be unmistakable, the lesson unforgettable, and the satisfaction of finally reclaiming control over my space and my peace would be worth every tense, exhausting, calculated second of this battle. The day I decided to put my plan into motion, I woke with a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration, knowing that everything I had carefully prepared would finally be tested. And as I walked through my house, double-checking the locks, the cameras, the subtle alarms I had installed, I could feel the weight of the tension pressing down on me, because this was no longer hypothetical, this was real, and every small detail mattered, from the placement of the note I would leave on Karen's windshield to the timing of my departure. And as I slipped the key into my pocket, I thought about the weeks of frustration, the passive-aggressive notes, the smug smiles, the way she had treated my home like a public space, and a surge of determination coursed through me, steel and fire in equal measure, because I knew that if I faltered, she would sense it and escalate, and that thought alone made my hands tremble. Yet I forced myself to take deep breaths and focus on the plan, envisioning every step in vivid detail, the locking of the garage, the simple yet deliberate note, the calm exit from my house, and the quiet observation from afar as she discovered that her usual tactics no longer worked. And when I finally left, the note resting unobtrusively on her windshield, I felt a strange thrill, like a heartbeat echoing through my chest, because I had created a scenario where she would confront her own arrogance without me needing to yell, to argue, or to engage directly. And for the first few hours, everything seemed to go according to plan, the neighborhood quiet, the suspense building. But then a twist arrived I had not anticipated, because as I was driving to the first stop of my 2-week journey, I received a call from a friend who lived nearby, and her voice was urgent, laced with disbelief and excitement, and she told me that Karen had reacted in a way I could never have imagined, that she had tried everything she could think of, calling other neighbors, waving at the HOA management, even attempting to contact me directly. But when she realized the garage was locked, her expression had changed, from smug satisfaction to confusion and then to panic. And hearing my friend describe it made my stomach tighten, because what I had planned as a subtle lesson had escalated far beyond my expectations. And I felt a thrill of vindication mixed with a flutter of fear, wondering if Karen might now take extreme measures or create a scene that could backfire on me. And as I drove, I imagined her circling the garage, trying to figure out how I had locked it, trying every key, every tactic she had used on others in the past, failing repeatedly, muttering under her breath, growing more desperate with each attempt, and the thought of her panic, normally a source of satisfaction, suddenly made my pulse quicken in a new way, because the intensity of the moment, the unpredictability of her reactions, had pushed the stakes higher than I had anticipated. And I realized that this was no longer just about a garage or even a boundary. It was a test of patience, composure, and ingenuity, because every action she took had consequences. And if she escalated, I had to be ready to respond without compromising my plan, without letting emotion overtake strategy. And as I drove further from the neighborhood, the tension in me grew almost unbearable, a cocktail of excitement, anxiety, and a deep, simmering sense of control. And then the real shock came when my friend described that Karen had gathered a small crowd of neighbors, all whispering and pointing, some offering advice, some smirking at her frustration. And in that instant, I understood that my quiet, calculated plan had created ripples far beyond the garage, that my patience and restraint had forced her to confront not just me, but the judgment and awareness of everyone around her, and the realization that she was now exposed in a way she could not hide from intensified my emotions. A mixture of triumph and guilt swirling together, because I had not intended for her embarrassment to be public. Yet the outcome was unavoidable, and I could almost picture her pacing back and forth, fuming, trying to maintain a sense of authority that had evaporated the moment she discovered the garage would not yield. And as I continued my drive, I began thinking of every possible way she might retaliate, every maneuver she might attempt to reclaim control, and the tension tightened like a vice around my chest, because while the situation was unfolding exactly as I had hoped in terms of control, it had taken on a life of its own, unpredictable and shocking, a drama that far exceeded anything I could have imagined when I first resolved to reclaim my garage, and the awareness that I was now part of a story that others in the neighborhood were witnessing made me feel both exhilarated and exposed, as if every choice I had made, every quiet moment of planning, was now a spark igniting a fire I could not fully control. And the more I imagined her frustration, the whispers, the rising tension among neighbors, the more my mind raced with anticipation of what she might do next, knowing that the coming hours would be critical, that any small misstep could unravel everything, yet also understanding that this was the turning point, the moment when patience and preparation met real-world consequences, and I felt a surge of power and adrenaline as I realized that I had created a scenario where boundaries mattered, where arrogance was met with strategy, and where one woman's sense of entitlement was being tested in a way she could not predict or dominate. And as night fell and I parked at my temporary destination, checking my phone for updates, the tension in me did not dissipate. It grew sharper, a knife-edge awareness that everything was now in motion, that Karen's reaction would determine the next phase of this silent war, and that every calculated choice I had made was about to collide with her unpredictability. And I understood in that quiet moment that this turning point was not just about the garage. It was about asserting control over my life, demonstrating my patience and strategy, and proving to myself that even the most audacious challenges could be met with calm, deliberate action. And as I set down my bags, feeling the lingering pulse of anxiety and excitement, I knew that the coming hours and days would define the story, that Karen's response would be intense and revealing, and that this single act, locking the garage and walking away, had shifted everything, transforming frustration into suspense, annoyance into strategy, and a simple garage into the stage for a dramatic and unforgettable confrontation. When I checked my phone that morning, I realized the situation had reached a fever pitch. The notifications flooding in like a storm as messages from neighbors described Karen's escalating frustration. The way she had banged on my garage door in the early hours, yelling for anyone to come to her aid, her voice sharp and desperate, and as I read each description, I felt a tense mix of satisfaction and dread because the stakes had shifted from quiet strategy to full-blown spectacle, a confrontation that was unfolding without me physically present, but whose intensity radiated through every report, and my pulse raced imagining her pacing back and forth, trying to reason, to charm, to manipulate anyone who would listen, only to be met with the unyielding fact that the garage was locked, that her entitlement had hit a wall that no argument or influence could penetrate. And when my friend called again, her voice barely concealing a mixture of amusement and disbelief, she told me that Karen had resorted to calling the HOA multiple times in a single morning, demanding explanations, claiming she had a right to park in my space, insisting that rules were being applied unfairly, and the thought of her frantic energy, her growing desperation, and the way neighbors were quietly watching and whispering sent a jolt of adrenaline through me, because what I had intended as a subtle lesson had become a dramatic display of consequences, a real-time reckoning for someone who had believed she could ignore boundaries without repercussion. And as I visualized her pacing the driveway, slamming her hands on the hood of her car, yelling into the phone, I could almost feel the tension radiating through the neighborhood, a mix of sympathy, curiosity, and silent judgment from everyone around. And that awareness made the experience feel intensely personal, almost cinematic, because I realized that my quiet, calculated patience had created a ripple effect, turning a private battle into a public lesson. And the more I pictured her contorted face, the way her carefully curated composure had finally cracked, the more a strange thrill mixed with a pang of guilt settled in my chest. Because though I had not intended to humiliate her, the fallout was unavoidable. And yet, the power of control I felt, knowing that every detail I had planned had forced this outcome without me needing to confront her directly, was undeniable. A surge of empowerment coursing through me as I imagined her realizing that her usual tactics no longer worked, that every attempt to regain dominance only intensified her frustration, And then came the moment that truly cemented the climax. When a neighbor shared a video they had captured, showing Karen circling the garage repeatedly, trying keys, checking for signs of tampering. Her face twisted in disbelief and fury, muttering to herself, calling out to anyone who might intervene, and hearing her voice, desperate and sharp, over the phone as my friend narrated it to me, made my heart pound, because this was the pinnacle of the silent war, the apex of tension, the point where strategy and emotion collided in a way that was vivid, inescapable, and unforgettable, and I realized that Karen's panic was complete, that her sense of control had evaporated, leaving only confusion and anger, and as I imagined the scene unfolding, I understood the full emotional weight of the moment, how her sense of entitlement had been tested, exposed, and ultimately undone by patience and foresight rather than confrontation. And yet, the fallout was immediate, as rumors began circulating through the neighborhood about the confrontation. Whispers about her behavior, speculation on what had caused her humiliation, and I felt a surge of anxiety because while my plan had worked perfectly in terms of controlling the situation, I had also unleashed a social wave whose reach I could not fully predict, and part of me worried that the HOA might step in, that neighbors might take sides, that the situation could spiral into something messy, but the larger part of me felt an undeniable satisfaction. A quiet triumph that came from knowing I had asserted my boundaries, reclaimed my space, and executed a plan that forced someone to face consequences without me compromising my integrity. And as the hours passed, messages trickled in describing her futile attempts to regain access, her voice increasingly shrill and frustrated. The way she had even tried to enlist another neighbor to intervene, only to be met with polite refusal, and each account added to the cinematic quality of the drama. Like a play unfolding in real life, every line, every gesture, every frustrated glance captured in vivid detail, and in that moment, I realized how personal this had become, that Karen's arrogance was not abstract, it was directed at me, at my space, at my right to be unbothered in my own home, and the emotional intensity of watching her scramble from afar was overwhelming, a mixture of adrenaline, satisfaction, and a twinge of guilt for the humiliation she was experiencing. Yet the clarity of justice in the situation was undeniable, because her choices, her disregard for boundaries, her assumption that she could take what was not hers, had led directly to this peak moment. And as I settled into my temporary accommodations, I felt a profound sense of control and awareness, knowing that the fallout, though dramatic, was the natural consequence of her behavior, and that this silent but intense confrontation had revealed much about patience, strategy, and the power of setting limits. And while the social ripples continued through texts, calls, and neighborhood gossip, I remained calm, observing and reflecting, feeling a mixture of exhaustion and triumph, understanding that the climax had arrived, that the peak of tension had been reached, and that now the fallout, the aftermath, and the resolution would follow, leaving me with a vivid memory of the day my garage became more than a space for a car, but a stage for a lesson in boundaries, authority, and the quiet, deliberate power of calculated patience. When I returned home 2 weeks later, the tension that had gripped me since the first sight of Karen's SUV in my garage had transformed into a strange mixture of anticipation and relief, and as I drove up my street, I noticed immediately that the neighborhood seemed quieter, subtly different, almost as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the story to unfold further, and my heart pounded when I reached my driveway and saw that my garage was empty, the locks intact, the space completely mine again, and for a moment I simply stood there, gripping the steering wheel, letting the weight of those 2 weeks of careful planning, observation, and silent strategy settle over me, because in those moments, I realized that the real victory had never been about the car or even the garage. It had been about asserting boundaries, claiming my right to control my own home, and proving to myself that patience and thoughtfulness could outmatch arrogance and entitlement. And as I stepped out of the car, I noticed Karen across the street, her posture stiff, her expression guarded but resigned, a faint shadow of humility replacing the usual smugness, and I could feel a rush of satisfaction tempered with curiosity as I considered how much she had learned. Whether she fully understood the lesson or merely experienced frustration without insight, and I reminded myself that this had never been about humiliation. Though the spectacle had unfolded in ways I could not have predicted, it was about demonstrating consequences, the natural result of crossing a line and assuming others would not respond. And as I unlocked the garage and stepped inside, breathing in the familiar scent of home, I felt an unexpected lightness, a clarity that came from knowing I had faced a challenge, planned carefully, and executed with integrity. And when I glanced around the driveway, noting the subtle looks from neighbors who had quietly observed Karen's unraveling, I realized that perceptions had shifted, that I was no longer just a participant in the neighborhood, but someone who had quietly asserted herself, someone who had shown that calm, deliberate action could create meaningful change, and in that realization, I felt a deep sense of empowerment, tempered by empathy, because I understood that Karen's arrogance had been born of habit and entitlement, not malice. Yet the experience had changed her, or at least her approach, and perhaps the entire dynamic of the neighborhood, because people had seen boundaries respected and consequences applied without drama, without shouting, without chaos, and I felt the profound satisfaction of justice delivered subtly but unmistakably. And as I closed the garage door, locking it with deliberate care, I thought about the lessons embedded in those 2 weeks of tension, strategy, and anticipation, the lessons about patience, observation, and the quiet power of standing firm without escalating conflict. And I understood that the emotional journey, the roller coaster of anxiety, anticipation, and satisfaction, had transformed me as well, teaching me the value of careful planning, the importance of self-respect, and the ability to face challenges with composure. And as I stepped back and looked at the street, seeing Karen retreat to her own home, her movements subdued, the energy that had once dominated the neighborhood now tempered, I felt a subtle pride, a sense of accomplishment that was both private and public, because the lesson had been witnessed, the boundaries reinforced, and the respect quietly restored. And as I walked into my house, feeling the familiar comfort of walls I controlled, spaces I maintained, and decisions I could make without interference, I reflected on how small actions, deliberate patience, and careful strategy could ripple outward in ways I had never imagined, reshaping relationships, perceptions, and even the social fabric of a neighborhood. And I realized that the garage, the seemingly insignificant arena of conflict, had become a symbol, a testament to the quiet but powerful truth that integrity, preparation, and calm assertiveness can overcome arrogance and entitlement. And as I settled into my living room, taking a deep breath and letting the weight of the past weeks wash over me, I felt an emotional release, a mixture of triumph, relief, and clarity, because I had not only reclaimed a physical space but had also strengthened my own sense of self, my confidence, and my ability to face challenges without yielding to panic or anger. And in that moment, I understood that the conflict had resolved not through confrontation or fury, but through thoughtful action, careful observation, and deliberate patience. And as I watched the sunset cast a golden glow over the neighborhood, illuminating both my home and the street where the silent drama had unfolded, I felt a quiet, enduring satisfaction, knowing that boundaries had been respected, lessons had been learned, and I had emerged not only victorious but also wiser, calmer, and more aware of the subtle power in measured action. And in the soft hum of evening settling over the houses, I allowed myself to reflect on what had changed, how people had seen me differently, how Karen had faced consequences, and how I had proven to myself that even the smallest spaces, the simplest boundaries, could carry immense weight when met with strategy, integrity, and courage. And as the last light faded from the sky, I smiled, feeling both the end of the conflict and the beginning of a renewed sense of control, self-respect, and quiet triumph, understanding that the story of the garage, the battle with Karen, and the 2 weeks of tension would remain a lasting reminder of the power of patience, foresight, and unwavering resolve in the face of audacity. And as I finally sat down with a cup of tea, the house calm around me, I felt complete, the emotional journey resolved, the lesson clear, and the satisfaction profound, knowing that the battle had ended with dignity, authority, and the quiet, unmistakable victory of having reclaimed my space, my peace, and my confidence. In the weeks that followed reclaiming my garage, the neighborhood felt subtly different, a quiet awareness settling over the streets and lawns, an unspoken acknowledgement that boundaries mattered and that my decision to act with patience and strategy had shifted the energy of the community in ways I could see in the smallest gestures. The nods from neighbors who once avoided eye contact, the cautious smiles from people who had witnessed Karen's unraveling, and even Karen herself moved through the neighborhood differently. No longer the unchallenged force of entitlement, her steps measured, her conversations subdued, her usual smirk replaced by a faint tension that I could not have forced but that naturally emerged from the consequences she had faced. And as I reflected on the experience, I realized that the true impact went far beyond a parking spot or a 2-week episode of frustration, because I had learned something profound about myself, about the strength that comes from setting boundaries, the clarity that emerges from careful observation and strategic patience, and the quiet power that comes from responding thoughtfully rather than impulsively. And I noticed changes in the way I approached other areas of my life, the confidence I carried into interactions at work, with friends, even in everyday decisions, a subtle assurance that my voice mattered, my choices mattered, and my sense of self-respect was non-negotiable. And as I watched the neighborhood settle back into routine, I recognized that the tension I had felt, the anxiety, the anticipation, the surge of adrenaline and satisfaction during the climax of the confrontation, had been a catalyst, mirror reflecting both my limits and my capacity to act with integrity under pressure. And I thought about the ripple effects of what had occurred, how my calm yet firm response had shifted not only Karen's behavior but also the culture of observation, respect, and accountability among the neighbors, because people who once turned a blind eye now seemed more attentive, more conscious of their actions, and that subtle change gave me a sense of quiet responsibility, knowing that by standing firm in one small but symbolic arena, I had influenced a larger social dynamic, and I also reflected deeply on the emotional journey I had undergone, the surge of fear and frustration when faced with blatant entitlement, the careful strategizing, the patience required to allow consequences to unfold naturally, and the eventual satisfaction that came not from humiliation or confrontation but from witnessing the outcome of deliberate, thoughtful action. And I understood that these lessons were universal, applicable far beyond a garage or an HOA, reminding me that in life, challenges will arise, often in ways that feel personal and intense, but the way we respond, with awareness, strategy, and self-respect, can transform conflict into growth, tension into clarity, and chaos into understanding. And as I settled into the rhythm of daily life, I noticed how much lighter I felt, the lingering anxiety replaced by a steady confidence, an internal knowledge that I could navigate difficulty, without losing myself, without giving in to anger, without letting someone else's arrogance define my experience. And even when Karen occasionally appeared in the driveway, her car parked elsewhere, her demeanor carefully moderated, I no longer felt tension, only a quiet acknowledgement that boundaries had been drawn, lessons had been learned, and respect, subtle but undeniable, had been restored. And in this calm, I realized the emotional payoff was far greater than I had anticipated. Because the satisfaction was not only in the victory itself but in the growth it inspired, in the affirmation of my ability to act thoughtfully, to observe patiently, to create consequences without resorting to confrontation, and to remain true to myself throughout. And as the days stretched into weeks, I reflected on the power of observation, of understanding the motivations and patterns of others, and the importance of letting outcomes unfold in their own time, realizing that sometimes the most effective resolution is not immediate action but measured patience combined with careful planning. And I thought about how much courage it takes to wait, to act deliberately, to resist the impulse to react emotionally, and how that courage, when exercised consistently, transforms not only a single situation but the person who navigates it. And in the quiet moments, sipping coffee on my porch, watching the neighborhood settle into its usual rhythm, I felt an almost cinematic clarity, the sense that this single confrontation had been a turning point, a lesson in assertiveness, strategy, and emotional intelligence, and that the subtle but profound shifts in my confidence, my awareness, and my ability to act without compromising integrity would resonate far beyond the streets of my neighborhood, influencing how I approached future challenges, conflicts, and decisions. And as I reflected on the entire journey, from the first moment I saw Karen in my garage, through the weeks of planning, the tension and escalation, the dramatic climax of her realization, and the calm aftermath, I understood that the story was not really about her, or even the garage, but about the quiet assertion of self, the reinforcement of personal boundaries, and the discovery of inner strength. And that awareness gave me a deep, enduring sense of satisfaction, a feeling that even in life's small, seemingly ordinary arenas, We have the power to stand firm, to act thoughtfully, and to shape outcomes with integrity. And as the sun dipped below the rooftops, casting a warm glow across the street, I smiled with a sense of completion, knowing that the lessons, the growth, and the quiet triumph would stay with me. A lasting reminder that patience, strategy, and unwavering self-respect can turn even the most frustrating challenges into opportunities for empowerment, and that true control is not about domination, but about navigating life with awareness, courage, and the confidence to act thoughtfully in the face of audacity. And with that reflection, I felt whole, calm, and profoundly grateful for the experience, knowing that the garage, the 2-week struggle, and the confrontation with Karen had become more than a story about conflict. It had become a story about resilience, growth, and the enduring power of standing firm in your own life.